Okay, so today, at the start of what will hopefully be a lengthy new series about the antagonists in the psychobilly, rockabilly movement of the 80s and the 90s, I've got Alan Wilson with me. Hello, Al. I'd like to say you're my old pal. I've
Yeah,
known each other for quite a while.
we have.
Best known for being frontman of the 80s psychobilly band The Sharks and owner of Western Star Records. But you've got a lot of strings to your bow. Give us a quick cap on what you're doing at the moment. And we're recording this in 2025.
Okay. Yes, right at the start of 25. I'm still busy with the studio, still busy with the label. Just finished a session yesterday, starting another session in a couple of days' time. Yes, the same old thing, really. Just like I feel like I'm on the sort of rockabilly treadmill.
Now, I'm taking you back. One of the idea of this series is to talk about the very early days when we were all young and everything was new and exciting.
Yep.
When, going back probably before that, when did you first become interested in music? And I will say before we start, a lot of what you're going to tell me, and hopefully some is in your book that you've published. If anybody hasn't read the book,
Okay. Yeah.
it's out there. But this is I'd like to get it from you. You know, we're actually seeing you now, and we're
Yeah.
talking about it face to face. So it's definitely worth a recap for anybody that's read the book. So, um, when did you first become interested? When you sort of pique your interest in music?
I've always been interested in music, really. I mean, my parents were really interested in music. Um, they both liked rock and roll music when I was a kid because they're that age. So they were always listening to Buddy Holly, Neil Sedaka, that type of thing in the house and in the car as well. And then my dad used to sort of, in them days, you'd go down the pub and everyone would have a sing song. My dad used to sort of play the piano. He only knew a couple of tunes on the piano, but he would play the piano and everyone would buy him a pint. And so he thought that was a great way to sort of, get drinking sort of thing. Um, so he used to sort of sing these songs in the pub. My uncle had a pub. And my mum was an organist, so she had keyboards in the house and stuff. So there was always music around me, and I remember being quite impressed with my mum being quite a good sort of. She was good on the keyboards. And then so then I was interested in sort of music, and I my next door neighbour at the time was a sales rep for a record company or a record distributor, I think it was. So every Friday he'd come home from work and he'd open the boot of his car and he'd call me over and say, "Help yourself," and I'd be able to pick any LPs out of his car, free samples that he had. And that could be anything from like Jesus Christ Superstar to the Best of the Move or Buddy Holly Greatest Hits or something. So I got quite into sort of records and listening to records, different styles of music, but my main thing was rock and roll. And then I started collecting old records. So I'm going back, I was born in 62. So I'm talking about this would have been very early 70s, around about 1970. I started record collecting. And I would use all my pocket money, go around the junk shops. We used to call them junk shops in them days. Vintage hadn't been invented at that point. So it was just house clearance businesses. And we'd go around, me and my mates would go around and just buy all the old singles for pennies, pennies, 50s records that were out of date. They weren't collectible yet. They weren't classics yet. They were just a decade out of date, really, those records. And you could get them for nothing. It was great. So that sort of got me interested in music. But what then got me interested in playing music was my mum and dad were quite sort of interested in music. And then I had drum lessons for 6 years when I was a kid. That got me very interested in playing music. And I started off on drums, and then I started a little band with a mate of mine. He was the only other rockabilly I knew at school. And then he got a drum kit as well. So then I thought, okay, I'll move on to guitar. And I'd already had an electric guitar when I was about 8 as a Christmas present one year. I hadn't really done much with it. So I kind of moved over onto guitar. I guess I would have been about 10 or 11 then. No, maybe I was in the senior school. I would have been about 11 or 12 when I seriously moved over to guitar.
Okay, you say you got interested in rockabilly, so was that like a thing around you at the time with the young
Well,
kids?
not rockabilly, it was rock and roll in them days. We hadn't even heard the word rockabilly really. And we certainly hadn't heard really any rockabilly music, because the rockabilly music started being sort of issued, I would say, mid 70s. And it was, you might remember this, so it was so exciting. It was fantastic. We'd never heard these tracks before. I was interested in Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, but that was kind of mainstream rock and roll. And then all of a sudden we started hearing all these, like, you'd get an LP come in the record shop and it'd be chess rockabillys
Yeah.
or imperial rockabillys. And we think, what the hell is this? It's all stuff we'd never heard before, but it was fantastic music. It was actually, to me, it was more exciting than 50s rock and roll, because it was kind of that underground, the less successful music, really, and there was, as you know, some right little nuggets in there, some gems. So that's what really got me into rockabilly, was when they started. And I was going to like rock and roll dues, gigs and stuff when I was 13, 14, as a teddy boy. I was a little teddy boy then. And suddenly the DJs would start playing things like jungle rock, or all this kind of rockabilly stuff. And you think, what the hell is this? It's fantastic. And so then I found myself moving more towards like the rockabilly style of music, more so than the rock and roll.
So when you started playing in a band, that was the sort of music you were playing first of all?
No, well, yeah. When I was a little kid, me and my mate had like a little rockabilly band, but there was only two of us, so we had to have drums and guitar, and we both sang. Didn't play any proper gigs. We just rehearsed a lot. And then I joined a band that was doing like covers, but that was everything from Pink Floyd to Chuck Berry. That was just like a function band type of thing. I was about 16, 17 then. That was paid work. We would get paid for that. And we'd play in like pubs, clubs, that type of thing. Didn't last in that band long, because it wasn't really what I wanted. It was a way of playing music, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And then at the time, my ex-wife, her two cousins, one had a drum kit and one had a bass guitar. And so I approached them and said, "Do you fancy starting a rockabilly band?" They didn't even know what rockabilly was. I had to kind of ram it down their throats, really. So we were like a Ted band. That was in like the late 70s by that time. So uh, I would have been about 18, I guess.
And was
And
that the Sharks? The early
it was the what became the Sharks. Yeah, we were called. In fact, in them days, we were called the Dixie Rebels. So it was all that South's Gonna Rise Again malarkey, which was kind of acceptable back then. And to be honest, we did quite well. And we played loads of gigs. I supported like all my heroes, like Crazy Cavan, and you know did the whole rock and roll circuit thing for a couple of years. They weren't really into it, if I'm honest, but they liked being in a band, but they weren't rockabillys. Um, and then eventually we got on this television series, and it's quite a well documented story, really. We got on this television series, and I started getting letters from the BBC. It was a BBC series called Rectangular Picture Machine, RPM it was called. And this bloke this kid started writing to the BBC asking for my phone number because he wanted to join our band. And he was a young double bass player. But the BBC wouldn't give him my number. But what they did is they forwarded the letters to me. And I read the letters and thought, oh, who's this? Never heard of him, this young kid. And then we got a gig, and you were there, Simon, I think. We got a gig supporting Janice Martin and Ronnie Hawkins in Cornwall.
Aaron
So
Sands.
yeah, in the southwest of England, and they couldn't make it because they were brothers and they had a family wedding to go to, and they couldn't make it. And I was gutted because obviously American rock and roll stars coming over, and we got offered a support slot, and I really wanted to do it. So then I started thinking, I thought, well, this kid who's been writing to me wants to join the band. He's a double bass player. Maybe he could stand in on bass and I could find a drummer and I could still do the gig. So I contacted this kid, and his name was Steve Whitehouse. And he was just he was still at school. He was 15-year-old, just learning to play the bass and just starting out. And he was really into the Stray Cats and all that, because that had started to happen at the time. This is in like I guess this would have been about I don't know,
1982 it was.
82 was it? Okay, so he was into things like Shaking Pyramids, Stray Cats, that sort of stuff, and he'd already been in a little band himself. I think he still was in that band at the time. So I contacted him, and he said, "Oh, I've got a drummer as well. If he can stand in and help you out if you want." And that was Hodge, Paul Hodges. So I had a second-hand guitar shop at the time um, in the next town. So I said, "Well, look, come round Saturday after when we shut, and we'll have a little jam and see how we get on." And they turned up double bass and drum kit in my little shop, set up, and when they started playing, although they were kids, I was a little bit older than them. I was probably about 19 by then. They were absolutely fantastic musicians. I was really impressed with both of them. And so we done the gig, which you were there, and after that I couldn't go. It was difficult for me to go back to the other two guys because they weren't really into it, and they were a bit kind of wooden. I don't want to be disrespectful, but they just weren't as good as these two young kids. Do you know what I mean? And so in the end, it might not sound like a very nice thing to do, but I got rid of the other two, and I invited Stephen and Hodge to join the band. And by that time, just about when we went on the television, we had changed our name to the Sharks because I'd got sort of fed up with all that Confederate flag nonsense. So I wanted to move away from that, if you see what I mean. So by the time Hodge and Steve joined the band, we were already called the Sharks then, and then they kind of came on board, and then it sort of once they because they were into rockabilly, once they came on board, it completely changed the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, compared to that first gig and then Bantam Rockers, you sort of developed into like a psychobilly band, from what I would describe as a neo rockabilly band when you did that
Yeah,
first gig.
yeah,
When did you become aware of the psychobilly sort of movement? That was only a fledgling then, wasn't it?
yeah. There was no psychobilly scene as such back then, but I remember the first time I became aware of psychobilly. I was supporting with the old lineup, with Kevin and Paul, supporting Flying Saucers, and it was in Southampton Guildhall, which is a massive, beautiful venue. They used to do big all dayers there, and we were supporting Flying Saucers there. And in them days, you get 4,000 people come to a gig. It was blinding. So I was on the stage packing my gear down because we had to get our stuff off the stage before the Flying Saucers came on. And as I was packing my leads down and packing my amp down and stuff, DJ played a song I'd never heard before. And I thought, oh, I like this. And the dance floor just emptied because those rockabilly people didn't like it. And I've told this story a million times. I looked out and I saw it was like the Red Sea parted. Everyone walked off the dance floor, which is a DJ's nightmare. But left on the floor was about 5 or 6 kids. They looked like rockabillys, but I thought they were fighting. I thought, oh, here we go. We've got trouble here. And then I realized they weren't fighting. It was this kind of weird well, it became called wrecking, didn't it? But it was the first time I'd ever seen that. This would have been about 1981, I guess. In fact, I think it was March or April. It was spring of 81. And the record they played, I later found out because I went over to the DJ and said, what's that you're playing? And he showed me the record, and it was Voodoo Rhythm by The Meters. And he said, oh, it's a new single's just come out. And that was the first time I didn't even know it was called Psychobilly then, to be honest. I just thought, I got to get that record. It's fantastic. So that was on a Saturday night. On the Monday, I went to the record shop, ordered the record, got the record. And then I think the next single I got by The Meteors was probably Radioactive Kid, Graveyard Stomp. Loved that, really loved that. And then sometime later, maybe 6 months later, that first album came out.
I'm not sure it was even called psychobilly back in those days, was it?
I
I,
don't
don't, I
think it.
think that
Yeah, I don't think it was. I don't remember. And I think the first time I ever heard the phrase psychobilly was quite a while later. And although, like my band at the time, the lineup I had at the time, there was no hope in hell that we would ever be a psychobilly band because they weren't even into rockabilly. Um, but then somewhere along the line, when Hodge and Steve joined the band, they were kind of more up to date, if you know what I mean. And Steve was never that into psychobilly, if I remember rightly, because I remember when I wrote that song Moonstomp, he kind of protested a little bit about it, and he wanted me to call it Rockabilly Moonstomp because I think he didn't like. I'm not sure whether he sort of didn't like the psychobilly thing, or he was just really more into like rockabilly, like Shaking Pyramids, that sort of thing, you know. But somewhere along the line, I mean, I was really influenced by that first Meteors album. I thought it was a great album. I still do. And somewhere along the line, we did drift into that, what we would now call psychobilly way of playing, you know. And the Rockabillys hated us at the time, absolutely hated us. We couldn't get a gig. Every time we'd done a gig, you know, they had either turn the power off or kick us out, or no one would turn up because there was no psychobilly scene then. And I think it was just like the Meteors, just go around and playing gigs, and the Meteors had a following, but we didn't, you know, so we couldn't really play. It was, we only played half a dozen gigs really, and none of them were very successful.
Because you were at the real sort of cusp of the change, weren't you? Because that Take a Razor to Your Head video, you're all still in like pegs and stuff like that, aren't you? It was all like
right.
real sort of when it was just finding its identity. And
Yeah.
everybody did their own thing.
And when I saw those kids, what I thought were fighting in the on the dance floor, that's how they were dressed. I mean, they looked like rockabillys. Today, you'd look at them and think, "Oh, they're rockabillys." It looked like the polecats. You remember the polecats used to dress, pink pegs,
Yeah,
box jackets. They looked like that. They didn't. You wouldn't look at them and think, "Oh, they're psychobillies," because the psychobilly look hadn't happened yet. If you know what I mean,
yeah.
they were just rockabillys.
Because that gig at Perrin Sands, like me and my mate living in the sticks in Devon, you couldn't buy
Yeah,
pink pegs anywhere. But there was people in your audience wearing pink pegs, and be like, "Oh, those guys have got that gear on." But
yeah.
yeah, so you've started developing your own style. So how did the album come about?
So I had previously recorded a demo at this place called Mushroom Studio. I'd recorded that with the old lineup, sent it off to a few record labels. Like in them days, it was Magnum Force, it was Nervous, was a brand new label back then, and I got replies from all of them, and but none of them were really that interested. And Roy Williams wrote, I've still got the letter. Roy Williams wrote a letter back, and he said, really like the guitarist. I hate to even say this really publicly, but he said, I really like the guitarist, but the others are a bit square, is what he said. A bit square. The other two in the band are a bit square. But he said, I really like the lovely, clean, and he put it in inverted commas, lovely, clean guitar sound is what he put on there. So that was that. But he didn't want to release it. It was our own material, you know, but it was kind of a Ted band sound, really, electric bass and that. And Roy was more moving, like he had the deltas, the polecats, you know, all those. So he was not really interested in what he would look at us as being quite old-fashioned rock and roll, you know. And then when I met Stephen Hodge, they had just recorded 2 tracks for Nervous for a future compilation he was going to put out. And so they were in touch with Nervous as well. And back then, Nervous was the label everybody wanted to be on, really. So we went into a little, I mean, to call it a studio is a bit of a stretch, really. We went into this bloke's house, and he recorded us on the landing at the top of his stairs. And Hodge, he had taken the door off the airing cupboard, and Hodge had to sort of put his drum stool inside the airing cupboard. And his drums were just outside the airing cupboard. And the guy had coat hangers sort of hanging from the ceiling. And he would wrap these wire coat hangers around the microphones, and they were just hanging above the drums, you know. It was so amateur. And we recorded a couple of songs. I mean, I think we'd only known each other a fortnight or something by this time. And we recorded, off the top of my head, it was Skeleton Rock, which Steve wrote. Ghost Train, which Steve wrote. That's a good song, if you ask me. Take a Razor to Your Head, which I wrote. And I can't remember what else. We'd done about 4 songs, maybe maybe 4 or 5. I can't remember. Phantom Rockers, which we had rehearsed that one in my local pub, Skittle Alley. The only kind of rehearsal I ever remember us doing at the time. Anyway, we recorded those songs, sent the demo off to Roy, and he loved it. Roy just said, "Yeah, well, I'll have an album." In fact, we went down when we met up in the music shop, when Stephen Hodge came to the music shop and we had a jam. We rang Roy up on the phone, and we played live to him down the phone, and he was loving it, absolutely loving it. And he said, like, "Yeah, you're just what I'm looking for," you know. So we went in the studio, done that demo. Roy said, got an album deal." And then we went back into Mushroom Studio, which is where I'd previously recorded with the other band, with the other lineup of the band. And we recorded the rest of it, which, was Charlie, whatever else is on that album, Death Row, those songs.
So those ones you've done in the airing cupboard and on the landing, the actual ones on the album?
Yeah, it's a bit of a funny story, really. They sound awful, those recordings, because not only were they done, I've just made a mistake, actually. I think Ghost Train was done in Mushroom Studio, by the way. Sorry. Not only were they done in a terrible little bedroom studio setup, really, but I think Steve had the master tapes for that. Steve took away the master tapes, and all we had was a few cassettes to listen to. And then when the record actually got pressed, Roy Williams said to Steve, "Oh, can you come up to London and bring up the master tapes?" And there was some kind of mix-up with the master tapes, and so I think he took up the multi-track tapes and not the master tapes, or something like that. So they couldn't use the proper master tapes to make the album. So Steve had a cassette in his car or something. No, not even in his car, because he wasn't driving then. He was too young. But anyway, had a cassette in his pocket or something of, some shitty old knackered cassette. And they took it off the cassette to make the LP. So if you listen to that LP, there's two distinct sounds on that LP. There's the Mushroom recordings, which was done properly. And then there's about 4 songs taken off a cassette, which, today I wouldn't allow that on my record label. But back then it was all, we didn't know what the hell was going on. We had no say so in anything. Do you know what I mean?
When you say when it's recorded at Mushroom Studios, did you? I've been to your studio, so you do it. You lay down track after track. Was it like that? Did you go into a live room and just play? How did it work?
How it worked was we went into a live room. The drum kit was behind, they called it a drum cage. It was like a partition with the drums behind, a Slingerland kit. I remember it distinctly. And Hodge played that. It belonged to the studio. I played for a twin reverb Fender amp, and the bloke who owned the studio said, "Oh, we had Crazy Cavan and the Rhythm Rockers in here last week, and Lyndon Needs used that guitar." So that was good enough for me. I was well impressed with that. Steve played the bass acoustically, kind of over there sort of thing, so we were all spaced apart a little bit, and we just sang and played looking at each other, because we didn't know any different back then. And then our vocals got replaced. So they were like guide vocals. Our vocals got replaced, and I think we did a few minimal overdubs, like our mate Simon, who was kind of our roadie, for want of a better word at the time. He sang backing vocals on one of the tracks, because he was good. He had a good voice. He was a good singer. But yeah, it was pretty much, other than that, pretty much recorded live.
Brilliant. So you were all very young when you did all that. I mean,
Stephen Hodge were even younger than me. I mean, and I have to say, credit to them, they were exceptionally good musicians. For I mean, they were school kids, but they knew what they were doing. They were great.
Did you have any guidance? Did you have like a manager or somebody that said, "Look, lads, this is," did you just sort of find your way and hope that people were being honest with you?
And when I was in the previous lineup, we had a manager who was a DJ, a Jewish guy, but No, once I got with Stephen Hodge, we just kind of did it all ourselves, and we were lucky because, well, I considered it. We were lucky because Roy Williams looked after us. So we signed a contract with Roy. I read it. I took the contract to my dad. My dad sat down and read it. We could have gone to a lawyer, but we didn't. You know, it says in the contract, you're better off seeking legal advice before you sign this, but we didn't. We just signed it. I read it. I think I understood it, and I think my dad understood it. And it turned out that Roy's looked after me throughout the years. And Roy said to me at the time, it might not be the best contract in the world, but I do stick to my word, and he has with me. I have to say. So we were lucky because not everybody gets that experience.
Yeah, and you stayed friendly with Roy Williams all your life, didn't you?
Yes, to this day. I mean, a lot of us owe Roy Williams a massive debt, to be honest, because what it's easy to forget is when you're a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid and a record company pays for you to go in the studio and pays to release your record, you're Johnny Nobody. And that's a massive gamble for someone to take. And he gambled on us. Do you know what I mean? And I don't feel like I did the right thing with Roy because the record had been out about a fortnight and I left the band, which is a bit of a kick in the teeth for Roy, really. But when you're young, you don't consider these things, do you?
Yeah, but things started to. I mean, I didn't realize it was that soon after, but that was a very still a well received album now. People sort of say it's one of their favorites from like 40 odd years ago. So
The honest truth is, Simon, when we went in the studio, we were in the studio about, I don't know if it was 4 or 5 days, I can't remember. We slept in my dad's car out in the street outside the studio. We didn't even have a hotel, right? I mean, we must have reeked by the end of that week because we didn't have a shower, not for the whole week. But when you're a kid, you don't think of these things. And we had no songs. So Roy literally said, I want you to go in that studio and record an album. And it was literally like next week. We had no songs. I can't remember us ever rehearsing. And we were literally walking down the steps in the morning, coming out of my dad's car, walking down the stone steps to the basement of this house where the studio was. And I can remember us writing songs walking down the steps, saying, well, I'll tell you what, you do this and I'll do that and we can sing that. And we were cobbling the songs together on the journey between the car and the studio, which was literally 10 yards. So how that album ever came out any good, I have no idea.
That's actually in the essence of original rockabilly, that though, isn't it?
I guess it is. And I think personally, I don't like that album. I've always said this. I don't really like that album, but some people like it. That's great. But I think the appeal of that album, if there is any, is its naivety. And it's the reason it has that quality is because it wasn't preconceived. It was literally on the fly. It was done on the fly,
Yeah. So the Sharks came to an end. You want to talk about what happened there?
Yeah. I mean, we didn't get on. I hardly knew those two guys, and we kind of got together really quick. I mean, a lot of bands, they grow up together. They're friends from school and everything else, and they start a band and blah blah blah. We just didn't know each other, so we got sort of thrust together. It was all happening, all exciting, and then I realised that we perhaps didn't get on very well, and then we went to Holland. We did a gig in Holland and got on each other's nerves, and then coming back on the boat, I just said, I don't want to do this anymore, So I initially left. I said to them, you carry on without me if you want. I left the band, but then they didn't do that. I think Steve had already got wind of it, that I was cheesed off because he had started rehearsing with Simon Brand, who was in a local rock and roll band at the time called the Firebirds. So Steve had already started the ball rolling with Frenzy as a sort of I think he saw the writing was on the wall. Do you know what I mean? I came home and rang Roy Williams up and said, "Look, Roy, I'm sorry, but that's it for me." And Roy was trying to talk me out of it, and he said, "Give it another go, give it another go." But I wouldn't have it, and that was that. Again, youth, isn't it? When you're a kid, you've got no tolerance. You've got no. I just, I don't know. I'd had enough. And we weren't together 5 minutes, but I'd had enough.
Now that album, like we've said, a lot of people disagree with you and say it's brilliant, and it's a legendary sort of album. So you've did very minimal promotional live stuff with it because you didn't get many gigs, and
Yeah.
it did that well. Do you ever sort of think, well, if I'd stuck it, what? I
No.
know nobody got rich playing psychobilly, but how things would have been different?
No, I don't think along those lines really. And the way my life has panned out, I wouldn't change a single thing about it. So Steve went on to be successful in his own right with Frenzy. The Sharks got back together at some point in the future, and we had our day because we did end up going all over the world and doing all that anyway. So it kind of worked all out for the best. And the funny thing is, because the Sharks split up at their sort of peak, I think I don't want to sound, if I talk about this, it makes it sound like I think I'm something special. I'm not saying that, but people were starved of the opportunity to see the Sharks. So when we kind of reformed 10 years later, it was like, wow, the Sharks, Whereas when we were together first time round, nobody wanted to know us anyway. But it's that old kind of looking back through rose-coloured specs. People would come up to me and say, "I used to love the Sharks." I'd say, "Well, where were you then when we did those 5 gigs to empty halls?" You know what I mean? So it was all kind of mythology, really.
Yeah, no, you said it sort of rolls off the tongue. You reformed the Sharks 10 years later. Now, 10 years later, now it seems like nothing, doesn't it?
I know,
But
yeah.
but back then, I remember when you reformed the Sharks, and I was one of those. Um, but why did 10 years later? Sort of why? Why did you do it?
By that time, I was working as a freelance record producer, and I can't remember how it came about now, but I had to do an album for the Frantic Flintstones, and yeah, I know how it came about because Chuck used to, the Frantic Flintstones used to record it at a place called the Space Shed, and the guy who run that place, Swordfish, disappeared off the face of the earth. Roy Williams rang me up and said, "Do you want to do an album? Chuck Harvey's looking for a producer. Do you want to do an album with the Flintstones?" So Roy put me up for that job, even though it wasn't going to be for Nervous, it was going to be for Cherry Red Records. And so I got that job, did some demos at my home studio with Chuck, got on really well with him, liked him. And then when it came to doing the proper album in a nicer, bigger studio, Gary Day was going to play bass on it. And at the time, Gary was touring with Morrissey. And I loved those Morrissey albums that Gary played on, really loved them. So I was quite chuffed to be working with Gary. And then one day in the studio, Gary said, "Why don't you reform the Sharks?" Because he said, people would love that. And I was quite shocked because I didn't think anyone would even remember the Sharks. And I said, "Well, me and Steve don't really get on. The bass player, Steve Whitehouse, we don't really get on, so it wouldn't work." And Gary floored me by saying, "I'll play bass for you." And I said, "Would you?" And Hodge was on that session, actually. Hodge played on a couple of those tracks. And I said, "Hodge, did you hear what Gary just said? He's up for playing bass for us." And Hodge said, "Yeah, I'm in." So that's how we reformed. It was just as simple as that. Gary's idea.
And that was in the UK at least. I mean, the psychobilly scene had come and gone at that point.
Yes.
In Europe and elsewhere, it was still good. But I
Yeah.
mean, for the fact I got you guys on at the local pub shows you what the UK scene was like.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't it do that? The psychobilly scene in England goes up and down, and it's more troughs and peaks, isn't it? Really. But worldwide, it's still there. It's always somewhere, isn't it, around the world?
Yeah. So you recorded "Recreational Killer." That was it. Was that Walnut Bank?
Yes, that's right. Same place as I did Jamboree, which you came to that session, didn't you? Because I think you're on. Did you do backing vocals on that?
Chop chop slash slash hi ho. Yes, that was me.
That was you. Yeah, I think that was the first time.
Well, one of them.
Was that the first time we like properly met? I think.
So I think, yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I didn't realize, but then I said, oh, I was at that Sharks gig and all that stuff. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I remember you giving me some photographs of that gig actually.
yeah.
Uh,
This was Steve had the bass, didn't he, with the stars and stripes on it, and
yeah,
screamed a lot.
that's right. The one on the front cover of the Phantom Rockers album. Yeah. So yeah, my power's low on my phone, so we might get cut off. Yeah, so that was that 1992. That was, I think,
Yeah.
and then I did Recreational Killer with Gary and Hodge. Enjoyed that, liked that album, and we sort of went off, all over Europe and Scandinavia and what have you, and had some good fun.
Now,
That
in
was
that time, you met some nutters.
some nutters. Well,
there would have been, I mean, because I mean, I was around some of the time, not a lot, but with other bands. I mean, there were some big characters there. Let's call them that.
yeah, yeah. Well, there is in that psychobilly scene anyway, isn't there? There's a lot of larger than life characters. Yeah, yeah, there are. I think I know who you're talking about.
No, no, not really. It's nobody I'd want to mention in case they come knocking on my door. But I mean, but there was quite a few sort of funny incidents. Anything in particular that springs to mind?
Oh,
In those 90s days.
there's so many. So I couldn't really pinpoint one in particular, but I mean, it was just a catalogue of disasters and you know, just yeah, it's just too much to even go into detail, really. But I don't know. I look back and I think, how the hell did we ever even find our way home? Sometimes,
You're the
from
same as me. You
whatever
know what they
country.
know where you live.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I do remember the wheels falling off literally one day.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Someone loosened the wheel nuts on our van, didn't they? Because they took exception to us or something. I don't know.
Never
Yeah,
flip. So then fast forwarding now, you're the boss of Western Star. You've been doing that for decades now. You've got
yeah,
a massive catalogue. You're still recording the current bands in the scene. You've also been heavily involved with and currently still are with the Joe Meek T-Chess tapes.
yeah.
So music still, well, is your life.
That's right. Yeah,
Is
and
there
I've been
any? Yeah, sorry, carry on, mate.
yeah, I've been very fortunate. That my passion in life is music, but it's also my job, and it has been for 30 years or whatever. Um, there has been times when I've had to take a real job. Uh, I haven't done for probably 25 years now, but I've had to have a part-time job sometimes here and there, but not since. Well, I've been in this building now 20 years. So yeah, I haven't had a proper job for quite a long time now.
Is the psychobilly scene as a performer or a recording artist definitely behind you, or is there the potential for some more sharks or at least Alan Wilson?
I can't
Psycho-
see me. No, I can't see me. I mean, I do play guitar in a rockabilly band now and again these days for a mate of mine, but so I have been playing live down near. I'm playing down near you actually in March, but yeah, I can't. I mean, psychobilly is a different thing, really. That I, I feel personally like to be like a psychobilly is like a kind of an angry, savage kind of music, and I don't really feel that way anymore. I'm a bit quite laid back, and for me it would be a bit fake if I got up there now and started ranting and raving.
Finally, Al, um, any anything that you wish you'd done that you hadn't done in those days?
Um, Not that I can think of, mate. I'm not one for having regrets or anything like that. There's probably a couple of people I wish I'd been a bit nicer to. Because I've now got I'm 63 any minute now, so you with age comes a different outlook on life, doesn't it? I guess everyone's the same, but yeah, um, on the whole, I think I wouldn't change too much about it.
Brilliant. Well, Al, thanks ever so much for your time. It's nice to see your face for We haven't seen each
Yeah,
other for a while, but been in touch.
you too.
Thanks very much for being part one of the series. And yeah,
Thanks for
thank
asking.
you. Thanks very much, Al. Cheers.
Cheers, Si.